These long, thin strips of fabric are the selvage edges off of my fabric, and you can see they're all different lengths and widths and colors. I cut 2 pieces of organic cotton batting into 7 by 7 inch squares. I also cut a scrap of fabric into a 7 by 7 inch square, and then I put the fabric with the wrong side up underneath the 2 pieces of cotton batting. Then I started picking out strips from my pile of scraps and laying them on top of the little stack that I made with the batting and the fabric. And I tried to get a nice mix of colors laid out. It was kind of like arranging a bouquet of flowers. Once I was happy with my arrangement, I just tidied up the edges. I trimmed off the extra strips of fabric. I used my metal binder clips to clip the strips of fabric into place on top of the batting and the larger square of fabric. I picked out more strips of fabric to use to weave between the little stack that I created so far, and basically I just started with 1 strip and switched from going over then under each of the sort of vertical strips on my stack, and then with the next strip of fabric I wove it in the opposite direction, so first going under and then over each strip so that the pattern alternated all the way down the piece that I was working on. I took the piece over to the sewing machine and I started at one of the corners and sewed a diagonal line across all the strips of fabric, and then I moved my piece over 1 inch and sewed another line, and so on all the way across one side of the piece. You want to take your time and make sure that you don't hook any of the strips onto your presser foot, so you kind of want to hold them down as you sew. After I finished sewing from the center out to one corner, I flipped my piece around and I started 1 inch away from the center out to the other corner so that I had diagonal lines all the way across the piece. After finishing that first set of diagonal lines, I went ahead and straightened out the sides of the piece now that all those strips were going to sort of stay in place. I took my piece back to the sewing machine and again I sewed diagonal lines starting at one corner all the way across the piece so that now I had a kind of crisscross look of stitches. I got some more of my scrap fabric, some wider scraps, and I cut it into some long 2-inch wide pieces of fabric. I joined the 2-inch wide strips of fabric into a continuous piece by placing them with right sides together at so that they're perpendicular to each other, and then sewing a diagonal line right across the corner. I cut the tip of one end of this long strip into more of a pointy end, and then I also cut the extra fabric off of the seams. And of course I'm going to save those little triangles and use them in something else. Then I got my bias tape maker out and I threaded the long strip of fabric into the bias tape maker, and I used my iron to press it into a piece of double fold bias tape. Now you could absolutely buy some bias tape at the store, but making your own is a really great way to use up some of your smaller pieces of fabric. And it's kind of fun too. I opened up the bias tape and clipped it onto one side of my working piece. At the machine, I sewed the bias tape onto the working piece, making sure to leave a tail at the beginning of a couple of inches. And I am the first to admit that my bias tape skills need a lot of work, but I'm practicing and I'm getting better. I stopped my stitches before I got too close to where I started. I wanted to have several inches to work with at the end, so I stopped my stitches there. Okay, this next step is a little bit fussy, but definitely doable. I took the piece off the sewing machine and I drew a line on one of the loose ends of the bias tape. I drew a nice straight line. Then I folded over the other loose end of the bias tape and lined it up nicely with that first end, and I saw where the line that I drew was hitting the other end of the bias tape. I drew a line on the other end of the bias tape, And then I lined those lines up with each other and I pinned them together. Then I took it back to the machine and I sewed along that line that I had drawn with the pencil. I cut off the extra bias tape, and then I folded the bias tape back in place and finished sewing it on to the piece. Phew! Now that the bias tape is fully sewn onto the piece, I was able to fold those other ends of the bias tape around the raw edges. Can you sort of get a feel for what we're making here now? And I clipped the bias tape in place all the way around the 4 sides of the piece. And like I said, my bias tape skills still need a bit of practice, but I am definitely getting there. Last step here, I took it back to the sewing machine and I stitched the bias tape in place all the way around the piece. It's done, and it's a lovely little pot holder or hot pad or table trivet or mug rug. Did you guess it? I love using this at my desk to protect my table.
If you enjoy scrappy projects like this, we have a free Facebook community. It's all about zero waste sewing, crafting, and occasional lifestyle tips. I'd love to see you in there. The link is below this video.